Sorry, Rabbi.
A little bit chilly.
Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to the laws of Trumos Chapter 3. Let us share the screen. But before we go straight to today's chapter, as usual, let's see where we are up to in the Rambam.
Rabbi, may I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Just before we start.
Yes.
Is there available on your platform or whatever it is or elsewhere a glossary of all the terms that we learn, the Hebrew terms that...
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to see if I can find something, please, later.
Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. We are learning the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. The Rambam wrote several works. I think this is the only work that he wrote in Hebrew. It's his largest work. It has 14 volumes. And we are up to volume number 7, Sefer Zraim, which have all the laws relating to seeds and food. It has 7 subjects, 85 chapters. And we have already moved into the 3rd chapter within the book of seeds. I'm just trying to, don't know why this isn't working, but let's just move across. Here we are. We're in the book of seeds. It's the 7th volume of the Rambam. There are a total of 7 chapters in the book of seeds, and we are up to the 3rd, or 7 subjects, not 7 chapters, 7 subjects. We are up to the 3rd subject of the book of seeds. We learned all about, for starters, kilayim, which are mixtures, whether it be agricultural mixtures or mixtures of animals or mixtures of clothing. We had 10 chapters on that. And then we had 10 chapters on gifts to the poor, including recently, earlier this week, the Rambam's famous 8 levels of giving tzedakah. And now we move on to Trumos, which are gifts to the Kohanim, 15 chapters, so we should be learning this over approximately 2 weeks. Today we are up to chapter number 3. In general, the 15, something doesn't make sense. Oh, this was Kilayim. Let's move ahead. In general, the 15 chapters of gifts to the Kohanim of Trumos are divided as such. First, the last 2 days, on Tuesday and Wednesday, we spoke about situations where one is required or exempt from separating Trumah, this gift to the Kohanim. Today, up until Shabbos, we will learn about the actual process of separating Trumah, and then over the next 4 days till Wednesday next week, we'll learn about how Trumah can be eaten. And then the end of next week, we'll learn about how else Trumah can be used or distributed. And finally, in the last 2 chapters, we will discuss what happens if there is a mix-up. So that's what's on the program for the next approximately 2 weeks. Approximately 15 chapters on Trumos. For today, let us begin the discussion of how Trumah is separated. So it's actually a long chapter. There's 24 halachas. We'll start by discussing the amount that needs to be separated, or separating other amounts, allocating Trumah. We'll find out what that means to allocate it. Separating Trumos Meiser, which is a Trumah that the Levi would need to give from his tithe. Mixtures of Trumos Meiser, allocating Trumah and separating from one location. What's the difference? We'll get there. And finally, the final discussion will be how everything should be done in order. We've mentioned this a few times, and how that in itself is a mitzvah. Let's start by looking at the amount of Trumah that needs to be separated. Halacha number 1. There is no minimum requirement for Trumah Gdoila, for Trumah, according to the Torah itself. As the Torah says, the first of your grain, meaning even the slightest amount, even one kernel of grain fulfills the requirement for the entire grain heap. As an initial and prefatory measure, one should separate only according to the measures specified by the sages. In the present age, when truma will be burnt because of its impurity, a person may separate even the smallest amount as an initial and prefatory measure. So although originally the sages did give measurements for truma, if I remember correctly, we had it in last week's class. I think we said it was a 50th, 2%. So that was when the truma would actually be eaten. But nowadays that we're unable to eat the truma since we're impure, and since we're impure, that actually makes the truma disqualified from being eaten. So we don't want too much to be thrown away. Truma has to be separated, but it has to afterwards be burnt and discarded. So we don't want to discard too much food. So nowadays, even the smallest amount of truma can be separated. So if you are in Israel and you're going into a fruit and vegetable store, then hopefully they have already separated truma. If they haven't yet, if there isn't a reliable certification, then you would start by separating a little bit called truma and discarding that small amount. Now, how much did the sages establish? A generous measure is 1/40th of the crop. Okay. The average measure is 1/50th, which would be 2%. And a parsimonious measure is 1/60th, meaning a somewhat of a stingy measure is a 60th. So the rabbis actually gave 3 different options of how much should be measured. Generously, a person could give a 40th, average a 50th, which is 2%, or miserly, a person can give a 60th. That is the amount which we don't give nowadays since it is burnt. Nowadays we could give even the smallest amount, so nowadays it's discarded. As an initial and preferred measure, we may separate 1/60th of the crops as truma from species to which the priests do not pay attention. For example, carobs and kilissin beans. So if it's a type of food that the Kohanim themselves are not going to be eating much of, then there's no point in being generous in something that people aren't going to eat. So there you could set back to the 1/60th. Similarly, we may separate 1/60th of the crop as truma in the following situations. Truma separated from produce grown from truma. So here, it's questionable whether you need to separate truma altogether, because, as we'll discuss later. Because if it itself is truma, you don't need to separate truma twice. Or you could say it's been regrown, so now maybe truma needs to be separated again. So since it's questionable whether truma needs to be separated altogether, if I'm not mistaken, that's the reason why we say that here you could go for the smallest amount of 60th. Truma that is mixed with tevel. So if you had truma and it got mixed, which was the part that separated, and then it got mixed with produce from which truma was not yet separated, again, you could go to the 1/60th, or impure truma that became impure against one's will or inadvertently. So you actually didn't intend to make it truma impure, sorry. In all these scenarios, you could go with the smallest measure of a 60th. Truma taken from consecrated crops. If the crops belong to the Beis Hamikdash, again, you would go with the 60th, or crops that one had made holy, designated to the Beis Hamikdash. Truma separated in the diaspora. Truma from ketzach, kilissin, carobs, poor quality wild figs, red barley kernels, and the like, and produce grown in a flower pot that does not have a hole. So it's kind of like hydroponics over here. It's not actually in the ground. In all these scenarios, we do separate truma, but we could go with the smallest measure, which is a 60th. Similarly, when guardians separate truma from the produce of orphans, don't be truma on somebody else's expense. So it's not the guardians, it's the orphans. Therefore, the guardians will go with the minimal amount, which is a 60th. We generally have a principle whenever expropriating from property of orphans, we go with the smallest measure possible. One should not separate this truma with a measure, a scale, or by number. because the Torah did not specify a measure for this allocation. So if you're going to get too nitty-gritty, if you're going to start weighing it up on your scale, it's going to seem like that's part of the mitzvah. But we said scripturally, there's no measurement. It was only the rabbis that instituted it. Instead, one makes an estimation and separates a 50th according to his conception. So you just kind of estimate. One may, however, separate truma from produce that is measured, weighed, or counted. So if the produce has to be measured, weighed, or counted, that's fine. But the actual separation process shouldn't be done using special measuring tools. You should not separate truma using a basket or a container whose measure is known. He may, however, separate truma by filling half or a third of their measure. One should not separate truma by using half measure of a sa'ah because its half is also a measure. So basically, this is somewhat of a tricky question. Where in the Torah do we have a concept where the rabbis give an amount, but they say don't use a measuring tool, even though only you estimate by the eye. So that's here by truma. Since the Torah doesn't give any measurement, the rabbi said, we want you to give a certain amount, but we are prohibiting you from using a very specific scale for that amount or measuring cup, because then it would seem like it's part of the mitzvah. So instead, you need to just go by estimation. That was the first discussion, how much we separate. In summary, at least a 60th on average, a 50th, and at worst, or at best, a 40th. Okay. When a person separates a large measure of truma, meaning more than what he needed to, as long as he leaves a certain portion as ordinary produce, the separated portion is truma. If, however, he said all of this produce is truma, it's of no consequence. So the word teruma literally comes from the word harama, which means to raise. Raising means that you're raising from something. So, or to separate. So if you're going to say that it's all truma, then you haven't made a separation. You haven't raised something out of it because you're saying it's all truma. That won't work. But if you take 90% of the produce and you say, I'm separating this as truma, even though only a small amount remains, that's fine. You've just gone beyond what was asked of you, but it would be binding. If a person intended to separate 1/10 of his crop as truma, much more than he needed to, but it happened that he actually set aside 1/60th, so then that works because 60th is the minimum amount for truma. If, however, he intended to give the 60th as truma, but it happened that he actually set aside a 50th, then the separated portion is not truma. So since he intended to give less and it was a mistake that there was more, we say that the separation actually did not go as planned and he can redo that. He needs to separate once again because the separation was more than what he intended to give. More on separating other amounts. So the person sets aside truma and it happened that he gave 1/20th of his crop. Then that's truma. If he set aside truma and it happened that he gave 1/60th of his crop, and hence, so he added more produce for the sake of truma. So he sees it's only a 60th, so he decides to add some more. So the tithes must be separated from that additional amount. Very interesting. So since you first separated, and now you've decided to add, so the moment you originally separated, that mitzvah was done. Then we said the remaining, let's say you separated originally 2%. So of the remaining 98%, you now need to give 10% to the Levi, which means you'll also need to give the 10% from the whatever you added to truma, because you were doing truma after truma was already done. Now, what happens if you already gave it to the Kohen? So it means the Kohen, if once he finds out that part of the gift that he received was actually added afterwards, then it means that that added section needed the tithe of the regular Jew to be separated, and he should do so before he eats it. If a person set aside truma, and it happened that he gave 1/61st of his crop, slightly too little, so the separated portion is truma, but he must set aside a second portion to complete the measure that he originally intended to give. The additional measure may be set aside with a measure, a scale, or by a number because you're just topping it up. He should set aside the truma only from the produce that is encompassed in the same area as is true with regard to the initial separation. A little bit more about other amounts. So this last scenario was where he topped it up. When a person, next scenario, when a person separates a portion of the truma, however much he intended, that portion does not have the status of truma. Nevertheless, the truma from that portion should be separated from it and not from other produce. Let's do this again. Oh, sorry. When a person separates a portion of the truma, meaning, let's say he planned on giving this area, it's backwards over here, he planned on giving this amount, and he only separates half of that. So that's not considered truma because it's less than what he intended to give. Nevertheless, when he does so, it was ineffective, so he still needs to re-give truma. So you should make sure to give truma from that section and not from elsewhere, because we're concerned that maybe it was truma. A little complicated. Let's move along. When a person separates a portion of truma from one grain heap, so now we move on to allocating truma. So we've discussed pretty much until now different amounts. For starters, the different amounts. The first 4 halachas, or the next 4 halachas, was when you got it a little mixed up. You gave more than was expected, less than was expected. You needed to top it up. You needed to redo it. Now let's talk about allocating truma. When a person separates a portion of truma from one grain heap and a portion of truma from a second grain heap of the same species, so he shouldn't separate truma from one heap for the other, meaning it should be kept localized. Each separation should be for it, not for something else. The following rules apply when a person says that truma for this grain heap is in its midst. So he basically has this big heap of grain, and he says, okay, there in the middle, that's the truma. He didn't actually take it and separate it. He just pointed to it. He said, that's where it is. He allocated it. So if he specified a place, he says, yes, in that right-hand corner, northeastern corner, that corner is what's going to be truma, even though he didn't actually separate it. Since he specified a place, the north side or the south, so then he's designated truma and is obligated to separate truma from that particular portion. If he didn't specify a place, then he didn't achieve anything. Meaning, if you just say that somewhere in this grain heap there's truma, then there isn't because you didn't separate it yet. But if you're saying it's on the northern side, then you've given it a particular place. So you've kind of geographically separated it. You haven't physically taken it out, but since you've geographically separated it, then that's binding. And when you do actually go ahead and remove the truma, you'll take it from that section. If a person separating truma says, the truma for this grain heap is this, and the truma for this grain heap is like that one. At the place where the truma for the first grain heap ended, the truma for the second grain heap also ended. So he's got 2 piles, and on this pile he says, I'm going to give the northern corner to truma, and then on this pile he says, like that one. So this pile also, the truma will be on the northern corner. That's where he's allocated it. That's where it's been geographically separated, and so he'll take separation in the same place from both. The next 4 halachos deal with not separating truma, but trumas meiser. So I meant to put in the translations over here. I put in this little diagram over here. Before we continue, let's just refresh our memories. The Rambam's going to say this at the end of today's chapter. So the first separation is the first fruits. We literally separate the first fruits and give it to the kohen. The next separation is truma, which is approximately 2% of your crops to the kohanim. The next separation is 10% of what remains, and that goes to the Levi. That's called Meiser Rishon. Okay. The Levi, once he receives that 10%, gives Trumas Meiser, he gives Truma on his Meiser. So the 10% of Leviim's 10% for the Kohanim. Okay, so it's the 10% on the 10%. The 10% that the Levi gets, he takes of that 10%, and he now gives Trumas Meiser. He gives a gift to the Kohanim from his Meiser. And then that's what's called Meiser Sheidi Ani, which is the second tithe, which is taken to Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, or it's given to the poor, depending on the year. So in summary, first you give a fruit, then you give 2% to the Kohen, then you give 10% to the Levi, and then you separate another 10% to Jerusalem but to the poor. So we were just discussing until now Truma Gedola, which is the first gift that's given to the Kohen from the regular guy. And now we discuss Trumas Meiser, which is in pretty much the same concept. It's just instead of the regular Israelite giving a gift to the Kohen, the Levi is now giving a gift to the Kohen. I said 10% of 10%. I think it's a mistake. It would probably be 2% of 10%. Because that's how much Truma is, approximately a 50th. Let's see it inside. But just to again summarize, until now we were discussing how we give the 2% to the Kohen. And now we're going to discuss Trumas Meiser, which is how the Levi gives a gift to the Kohen. Let's go to Halacha 10. Trumas Meiser, what's going on over here? Okay. Trumas Meiser may not be separated by estimation. Instead, one must be precise in its measure, even in the present age, because its measure is explicitly stated in the Torah. So the gift that the Levi gives to the Kohen needs to be exact. So sorry, I wasn't mistaken. It is a tenth of a tenth. So the Levi gives 10% of his produce to the Kohen. So the Kohen gets 2% from the regular Jew, which there are many of, and from the Levi, which are fewer of, he gets 10% of his 10%. So that needs to be done by precise measure, not by estimation. Produce that is usually measured in volume should be measured in volume. Produce that is weighed should be weighed. And if it can easily be counted, it should be counted. If it could easily be counted, weighed, or measured in volume, it is praiseworthy to count it. More praiseworthy to measure its volume, and most praiseworthy to weigh it. So I guess each one is perhaps more precise than the other. The mitzvah to separate Trumas Meiser is for a Levi to separate it from the tithe given him. As the Torah says, when you take the tithe from the children of Israel, an Israelite may separate Trumas Meiser and give it to a Kohen, and then give the tithes to a Levi after separating the Trumas Meiser from it, a tenth of a tenth. So this is an interesting scenario. Let's go back to this page over here. If the Jew, before giving 10% to the Kohen, actually separated, let's think this through, 10% of 10%. Okay, I guess let's just keep it simple. So he had, let's say he had 100 kilograms of wheat. So he's about to give 10 kilograms of wheat to the Levi. So he had 100 kilograms of wheat, from which he had already separated his 2% to the Kohen. Should we do it all? Okay, he's got 100 kilograms of wheat. First, he separates 2% to the Kohen. So now he's left with 98 kilograms. Now, of the 98 kilograms, he now separates 10% for the Levi. So that means that he now separates 9.8 kilograms from the 98 kilograms. But then, instead of taking the 9.8 kilograms, or if we want to simplify it, 10 kilograms and giving it straight to the Levi, he does the Levi's job for him. He chaps his mitzvah. He goes and of the 10 kilograms, he separates 1 kilogram and he gives that to the Kohen as well. And then he gives the remaining 9 kilogram to the Levi. So what he's done is he separated the Kohen's gift from the Levi's produce before he gave it to the Levi. So if he does that, then it works. Okay, that was halacha number 12. Number 13. When an Israelite separates the first tithe, while the crop is still stalks of grain, so he doesn't wait till he gets the kernels out, he separates it as stalks and gives it to the Levi before it was threshed and before he separated the great truma. So he gave Meiser to the Levi, he gave the 10% to the Levi, the step number 3, before giving the truma, the 2%, to the Kohen. The Levi is not required to separate truma from what he got and he instead just gives Trumos Meiser. So again, the guy, let's say, had 100 kilograms. So instead of first separating 2 kilograms and giving it to the Kohen, he went ahead and he separated 10 kilograms and gave it to the Levi. So if the Levi knows this, he doesn't need to take from his 10 kilograms and give 2% of that to the Kohen, because it's not the Levi's job. It was the Jew's job, but he missed it. So it's not, the Levi wouldn't need to separate Truma, Gedola. He would need to separate his Truma, 10% of the 10%, but he won't need to separate the Truma Gedola, which the Jew forgot to do. Okay. If, however, the Israelite threshed, that's if it was still in its stalks. If, however, the Israelite threshed the crop and separated a tithe of the grain and gave it to the Levi, before he separated Truma Gedola, what he gives to the Kohen, the Levi is obligated to separate the great Truma and Trumos Meiser. Since the crop has already been separated into kernels of grain, the obligation to separate Truma has fallen upon it. So now, if it was already turned into grain, once the Levi finds out that the 10% that he got had not already had the 2% removed from it for the Kohen, so it means that this produce is actually lacking a step. So since the Jew didn't do it, the regular Israelite, the Levi will need to do it for him. He will need to separate from this 10% a section to go to the Kohen in order for him to be able to eat it. Okay, that's halacha number 13. If I were to go and separated a tithe of the grain and gave it to the Levi, yeah, we just did that. Halacha number 14. Okay, we're only, we have a long way to go. Maybe we'll stop early and let's see how it goes. More about separating Trumos Meiser. When a Levi took grain while it was in its stalks, he should not give the Truma to the priest in stalks. Instead, we penalize him and require him to thresh the crop, winnow it, and give the priest a tenth of the kernels of the grain, which will obviously be more. He is not required to give him a tenth of the straw or the chaff. If he set aside Trumos Meiser while the crop was in stalks, as it was given to him, he must crush it and give the priest the kernels and the straw. Okay, so if the Levi took it before it was ready, he needs to give just the kernels. But if he did already separate of the kernels and the stalks, he needs to give it both. Why do they penalize him and make him crush it? Because he accepted the tithe while it was still in the stalks, and thus precluded the separation of Truma Gedola. So we've learned previously that the Kohen can only have his amount separated once the kernels have been removed. So the fact that the kernels were still in the stalks means that the amount, the gift to the Kohen had not been given. Since it had not been given, so we require the Levi to give more. He needs to give of just the final product of the kernels. That takes us to approximately halfway through. In the next halachas, he discusses what happens if there were mixtures. It was a mix-up of Trumos Meiser and other mixtures. You can take a look inside. That's 15 and 16. And then the next 6 halachas discuss how when you separate, you need to separate from the same place. So you can't separate from one pile for another pile. That's in Sabri, but he discusses a full 6 halachas on that. And finally, in halachas 23 and 24, he discusses the sequence, which I think is quite important. Let's take a look at these final 2 halachas. When Truma and the tithes are separated, we separate them in proper sequence. What is implied? First and foremost, one separates bikurim, which are the first fruits. Afterwards, he separates Truma Gedola, which is the approximately 2% to the Kohen. Then he separates the first tithe by Rishon, which is the 10% that he gives to the Levi. Okay. And then he doesn't mention here the second 10% that he gives to Yerushalayim. If a person separated the second, yeah, he does, and then the second tithe. If a person separated the second tithe before the first, so he first separated 10% to be eaten in Jerusalem or to the poor before separating the first 10% to be given to the Levi, or he separated the 10% before that which he gives to the Kohen, the Meiser before Truma, his actions are effective despite the fact that he's transgressed the negative commandment, which is that it needs to be done in its order. What is the source which teaches that a negative commandment is involved? The Torah says, do not delay your fullness offering or your priestly heave offering. Implied is don't delay the separation of produce that should come first. But lashes are not given of this prohibition. Finally, 24, when a person desires to separate the Truma Gedola and Trumas Meiser at the same time, which we said he can do, so he wants to separate both the 2% to the Kohen, and he wants to separate on the Levi's behalf the 10% of the 10% he's about to give to the Levi. He should separate 1/33 reoccurring of his crop. 300th of his crop. An average donation of Truma is 1/50th, which is 2%. And Trumas Meiser is 1/10 of the 10th, which is another 1%. So in total, he gives approximately 3%. That's mathematics. 10% of 10% is another 1%. So he gives 2% plus another 1%. Total of 3%, which is a 33.33 reoccurring. That's what the Rambam says. He should say 1/100th of the produce that is here, meaning 1%. The first 2% is going as my gifts to the Kohen, and the other 1/100th, which is on the side of what I separate. Sorry, 1/100th of the produce that is here on the side of the produce which I set aside is regular produce. The remainder of what I separated is Truma for the entire crop. Okay. Basically, of the 3%, the 1% is what he would be giving to the Levi, and therefore that's still considered regular as far as you're concerned. The other 2% is his actual requirement to the Kohen, something like that. The tithes which are necessary to be separated for these 100 portions of ordinary produce are at the side of the produce that I separated. The remainder of what I separated aside from the Truma is Trumas Meiser on the entire amount. A little tricky. Thanks for sticking around with us as we go through every section of Jewish law that exists in the Torah. So just to wrap it up, we have today discussed the 3rd chapter of Truma. There will be 5 general discussions about Truma, and we're on that 2nd discussion, which is the actual separation process, which will be discussed a little more over the next 2 days, and then we'll discuss eating it, using it, and more about mixtures of it. Thanks so much.